So today we are going into session 2, and specifically today what we're going to do is look at orientation psalms. So before we do that though, we want to do a quick recap. So last week we talked about the history of the Psalms and that they they go far back into Jewish history, but become a very distinct part of the temple life, especially under the Second Temple. And what we then have is some that were written very in ancient times, and others that are written all the way through the 6th century BC, and maybe even a little after. But they begin getting written down and formalized and used in the way that we know it today and organized. Because when we go through them, you'll see that we jump thematically. Sometimes we're with Moses, but we're not at the beginning of them. And yet then we'll just jump immediately over to kind of as if it is with David, and so on and so forth. And so it jumps all around time-wise, but it's put in a way of these 5 sort of books to kind of carry us through, these 5 sections of Psalms to carry us through. And as I talked about last week, we have synonymous, which is where the first line is then sort of repeated in just a slightly different way in B, line B. We have antithetical, which is where it says A, but B. So in other words, the example we used last week is I may fail, but
Please
God is
check
forever.
Your connection, but my speaker's in the computer.
Okay, and I'm gonna mute you. You got to stay muted, okay? No, she can't hear me. So, all right. So then we have synthetic, which is A and also B, and where it builds upon it and makes it much bigger and grander as a sort of theological statement. So synonymous, antithetical, and synthetic. The categories that we talked about, which came from Gunkel, is lament, praise, and hymn. Laments are just what we think they are. They're the bringing our pains and sorrows to God. The praises are about something specific, and then hymns are more generic and always sort of congregational or multiple people, whereas the praises can be both individual or they can be communal. And then finally, we then talked about Brueggemann's sort of pattern that he found within these praise, hymn, and lament psalms is that he saw a pattern that also mirrored the life of the Israelites and the Hebrew people, but also our life today. And that is the pattern of orientation when things are ordered and good, disorientation when things are in the miry pit, so to speak, and then we have reorientation, which is that process of coming out of the dark night of the soul. Sometimes it doesn't mean it's all better. It just means that we're coming out in that movement towards hope and sort of, as we would say in our Christian faith, of sort of resurrection moments. You know, if you think back, the women at the tomb, Mark tells us, is that the women run away in fear. You know, well, it's resurrection, it's reorientation, coming out of that disorientation of crucifixion, but it's still filled with emotion, filled with anxiety of the unknown, but within it, a shining hope and a shining light. So that's our recap of last week, which brings us then to our next 3 weeks, today and the following 2, of where we'll look at orientation, disorientation, and reorientation very specifically and directly. And so we're going to start today with then, for today's class, we're going to be looking at orientation psalms. And as the slide says, life is good. The Psalms of orientation were created, transmitted, valued, and relied upon by a community of faithful people where things are stable and steady. Things are beyond a doubt, and they are good in that season. Many of the orientation psalms give expression to that happy settlement, to the reality that God is trustworthy and reliable, and also gives expression to the decision to stake life on this particular God, as in Yahweh or Adonai, as is often said, and that many other gods to follow, as they are surrounded by all these other countries with their gods and their multiple gods. But God is the God for us. That's what these Psalms express. So oftentimes we see some things, some patterns. The personal name of God is often used, and that there is power in knowing that name. And so it is very intimate in speaking to God because of that trust and that reliance. But however, it's also worth knowing that the Hebrew people, the Jewish people, would never say and actually say Yahweh. They would say Adonai. And so a lot of times when vowel points then get invented, so the Hebrew language was first all consonants, which meant you could then kind of put vowel sounds in the words, and there was not necessarily always consistency. However, over time, there became a consistency, and they used certain marks to help tell you what sound to make between the consonants, and they're called vowel points. And so it would have the vowel points of Adonai. However, what would be spelled is the consonants of Yahweh. And I point this out partially also just because it's good to know of how the Jewish people would have used this language. But also, it's an interesting thing because that's also how we get the word Jehovah. Jehovah is actually a misunderstanding of when it's so much of our theology is Germanified, and I mean, put into the German language. And so when they would read, the Y would become a J, and with the vowel points of Adonai, but the words and consonants of Yahweh, you got Jehovah, which became a mispronunciation. But the other common name that is used for God is Elohim, and that's just another way of saying Lord. And so Elohim or Adonai would often be the spoken ways of saying God's name. And we do see both Yahweh and Elohim used within the Psalms. And there are other names used as well, but these two are the most common by far. So anyway, back to these orientation Psalms. These Psalms of orientation do not give a detailed report on a single event, but rather they describe how things are and how they seem to always have been. That's just how it is, so to speak. And we talked about the Psalms being expressions of living the Torah. You might remember I talked about how it's broken into 5 books, and each of them kind of, and those 5 books are to mirror, or the 5 sections, so to speak, and it mirrors the 5 sections or 5 books of the Torah, or the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. And one of the things we see over and over within the Torah is how God brings order from chaos. That in the story of creation is a sort of ordered life. We have in creation itself, we have order being brought and restored, whether it's with the Tower of Babel or in the story of Noah. We have order with the starting of covenant relationship, starting with Abraham through the patriarchs. And then we have ordered life as it goes from a family to a tribe to a nation, really. And in that order, then you have Moses giving the law as a way to order their lives together. And so in the Torah, we see creation and ordered life within that creation. And many of these Psalms are expressions, therefore, of creation faith. As Brueggemann says in the Message of the Psalms, they affirm that the world is a well-ordered, reliable, and life-giving system because God has ordained it that way and continues to preside effectively over this process of creation. So creation here is not about how the world comes to be, but rather affirms God's faithfulness and continued faithfulness and goodness in that creation. That it's not a one-time act, that creation is continuous and being experienced still today. Brueggemann also points out that these Psalms celebrate the status quo. And this is kind of that disclaimer that we always have to have with these orientation Psalms. Because if you are on the positive side of the status quo, then all is good. But obviously, not everyone is always in the good during a status quo. And so this in and of itself is not, as I said, always good, because it does not leave room for growth on the part of the psalmist. Because if everything's good and they are complacent, then they are less likely to seek to grow. And also, Brueggemann argues that the author or authors of the orientation psalms, as I said, were on the good side of the status quo and therefore spoke with conviction about the world being good, generous, and reliable, because that was their experience. However, we should always remember that in the status quo, the happy stay happy, but those who suffer below the surface are still suffering. So within these orientation psalms, there are sort of subgroups. And the first one is songs of creation. These are the most fundamental expression of orientation in the daily life and experience of the regularities that come with life, which are experienced as reliable, equitable, and generous, at least in the psalmist's perspective. In other words, our time is ordered by God according to the seasons of creation, which are the seasons of the year, seasons of life, and the needs of the day. And though in it all, we find ourselves safe and free. So through it all, we find ourselves safe and free. This does not take any kind of epiphany or religious insight, because it's just experienced and that's how it is. And so we rather just know it because we just know it. So those are the songs of creation. The next one, are kind of to build upon that, is the songs of Torah. If indeed creation is celebrated as well ordered, then we also acknowledge God's power, faithfulness, and graciousness. This order of creation is then experienced and understood through the lens of Torah. Remember that the Torah is the first 5 books of the Old Testament and is the moral law. But it is more than just moral law. You see, in other words, it is the ordered response that to God's orderly creation. So, in other words, that as God's chosen people, the Israelites respond graciously with obedience to the Torah, and not begrudgingly. We hear about all these laws, but in principle, it is a response, a faithful response to God's order in God's covenant to follow Torah. And so these psalms are sort of about that, about the response, the ordered response, and the ordering of life to Torah. The next one we have are the wisdom psalms. These psalms also respond to a well-ordered and reliable world, but with wisdom. This wisdom tends to be didactic or educational in tone and unstructured in its shape. So we've talked about Hebrew poetry. A lot of times these don't have that same kind of thing. They're more free form. And they are identified by their subject matter, wisdom. So talking about the Psalms about wisdom as experienced as a sort of divine wisdom. The next one is songs of retribution. This one always sounds so daunting, but these could be grouped with wisdom or even with Torah psalms. But there's only 2 of them, and they are Psalm 111 and Psalm 112. And they have a slightly different accent, and they present an unqualified statement that the world is ruled by God with moral symmetry. So this, in a way, even though throughout Scripture, a lot of times we don't necessarily see an equal balance of the good and evil, or the yin and the yang, this is very much, though, the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth mentality. In other words, they are more morality-based, and these psalms state that the world works in such a way that a person receives the direct consequences of their direct actions. So it's very, very much on a balancing of a scale through the lens of wisdom and Torah, but as experienced through the actions of individuals. And then the last one we have, before we get to jump into a few of these and to kind of explore them, are the occasions of well-being. On the occasions of well-being, so far the Psalms keep an underlying assumption that things are well ordered, safe, and reliable. And this system, or God's created order, works. And therefore, well-being Psalms talk about taking this system, taking this order into the network of systems in our own daily lives. For instance, things like our families, our households, our tribe, our town, our work, and our place of work. And so the theological point about God's governance in heaven is represented and reflected as an earthly experience of the same order and reliability and within, or reality rather, and reliability within the individual life experience, within the smaller systems. And so God is not always explicitly visible or even mentioned within these Psalms, but is discerned as the underwriter or guarantor of the critical points through which life is affirmed and enhanced through these systems being applied to the day-to-day life. Okay, so now we are getting ready to look at some Psalms, but before I take questions, one of the things I do want us to do, and this is again, last week I talked about how Brueggemann sees a way of moving forward and using this movement of orientation, disorientation, and reorientation as a way of engaging both the academic side of understanding what's happening historically and what's voice is being represented within the larger narrative of Scripture and within the Jewish Hebrew people, and so on and so forth. But also there's that tradition of sort of more self-meditative and trying to understand ourselves within it, or even our Christian faith. Because obviously the Psalms are written hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before Jesus walks the earth. And so they have their own historical context, but then also they do continue to inform our faith and our Christian faith, as well as our response and self. And so what Brueggemann offered was this understanding of Jewish psalmist Christian self. And that these are the four voices that we hear within each psalm, is that a Jewish voice, and a psalmist, an individual voice, the Christian faith and voice that we then read in it. So for instance, we talked a little bit last week about when Jesus then quotes the Psalms from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? And so we see our own faith in it today, as well as then what does this say about us as individuals and our own faith and our own day-to-day human experience as we go through the ups and downs and the trials and the joys that come with being human. And so those are the four reflections, and we're going to use those to, along with this understanding of orientation, then have this understanding of that reflection of Jewish psalmist Christian self within these this orientation season or orientation movement. So just as then a quick recap, because we have covered a whole lot, and I'm going to move the slides backwards. So just as a point of reference for us, we have 5 different groups. We have songs of creation that are about the daily experience of life's regularities in God's creation. We have songs of Torah about the need to acknowledge God's power and faithfulness and graciousness and understanding God's order through the gift of Torah. We have the wisdom psalms, which is that we respond to order with wisdom, and wisdom that is divine and comes from God. And these tend to be didactic and educational. And then we have songs of retribution, which Those are easy to spot because it's just Psalm 111 and Psalm 112. And they are sort of a little bit like Torah and a little bit by wisdom, but they have this moral symmetry within them. And they're more about day-to-day morality. And then we have the occasions of well-being, that the well-being ordered of the world is meant to be mirrored in our day-to-day lives, whether that's in families or at work or wherever it may be. And then finally, we are invited to then reflect as we engage each of these on the voices of the Jewish voice, the psalmist voice, the Christian voice, and then our own voice. And how do each of these inform our understanding of the psalm to therefore inform our faith? And Brueggemann specifically, as a kind of final thought on the four reflections, Brueggemann very much would say that we should go in that order. Start with the larger historical Jewish voice, the voice of the psalmist within that, moving then to the Christian voice, which comes, a few centuries later, but that our own faith is expressed with and through. And then finally, our faith as lived out today, and how does it therefore speak to us in 2020 and beyond. And then what we're about to do is we're going to dive into three Psalms. As I said at the beginning, we're going to look at three Psalms, two Psalms rather, Psalm 33 and Psalm 133.
Okay, so Psalm 33. Glasses on. Rejoice in the Lord, O you righteous. Praise befits the upright. Praise the Lord with the lyre. Make melody to him with the harp of 10 strings. Sing to him a new song. Play skillfully on the strings with loud shouts. For the word of the Lord is upright, and all of his work is done in faithfulness. He loves righteousness and justice. The earth is full of the steadfast love of the Lord. By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and all their host by the breath of his mouth. He gathered the waters of the sea as in a bottle. He put the deeps in storehouses. Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him. For he spoke, and it came to be. He commanded, and it stood firm. The Lord brings the counsel of the nations to nothing. He frustrates the plans of the peoples. The counsel of the Lord stands forever, the thoughts of his heart to all generations. Happy is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people whom he has chosen as his heritage. The Lord looks down from heaven. He sees all humankind. From where he sits enthroned, he watches all the inhabitants of the earth. He who fashions the hearts of them all and observes all their deeds. A king is not saved by his great army. A warrior is not delivered by his great strength. The war horse is a vain hope for victory, and by its great might it cannot save. Truly the eye of the Lord is on those who fear him, on those who hope in his steadfast love, to deliver their soul from death and to keep them alive in famine. Our soul waits for the Lord. He is our help and shield. Our heart is glad in him because we trust in his holy name. Let your steadfast love, O Lord, be upon us, even as we hope in you.
All right. Thank you, Linda. So nice long one. So thank you. At least I didn't say, who will read Psalm 119? So real quick, I've already did the spoiler alert, and I said that it was a song of creation. Is this, though, a lament, a praise, or a hymn?
I believe it's different. What is this?
So the answer is that it is it's a hymn. It's a common voice that comes together and sings together these words. And remember, a praise is about a specific moment, a specific incident, and this does not cover that. This is just general praise, and as then I said, it's a song of creation because it's a new song. It's saying that we are singing this new song and we sing about a new creation, and it specifically says that in verse 3. And it is the world about which Israel always sings that is the new world, and that Yahweh is now creating and is always creating. And so it's about that, almost that, behold, I do a new thing. God is always at work creating this new thing within. And so therefore the response is this new song. But what's funny and sort of ironic in that is that if it's always new, then it's also always holding steady at just that. And so we're going to break it into kind of some chunks. And so if you have your prayer book, or if you have your Bible in front of you, if you look at the first 5 verses real quick, in these first 5, and the reason, by the way, we only have to look at a handful of these, because the patterns that we see in this, and this is like your standard orientation psalm, the patterns that we're going to see as we unpack this are the very patterns that we see throughout almost all of the orientation psalms. And so this is sort of a good standard here. And so we just can kind of look at these chunks to pick up on some of these patterns. All right. So verses 1 through 5, it announces the theme and gives a good example of the basic structure of a hymnic expression. There is praise, and it gives 5 imperatives to the Jewish people, right? It says rejoice. Now, real quick, some of the words I say may be slightly different depending on your translation. I believe Linda was reading from the NRSV, and if you were following in it's the HarperCollins. Yeah, it's an NRSV. And then if you were following in the prayer book, it's going to be a little bit different. You could have NIV, King James. They're all going to be a little different. But nonetheless, there are 5 imperatives: rejoice, praise, make melody, sing, and play. And then there is a reason for the praise. And these are introduced by the word for. The psalm is praise in new song for the new world that is being experienced. And they keep Torah and belong properly to Yahweh's well-oriented life. So they're living in God's ordered creation that's being renewed constantly, and all is great in this world. And this is then matched with how God's word is upright and God's presence is good. So this section begins and ends with that personal divine name of God, Yahweh, and the double use of name in 1 through 3. And so this is being witness to the Creator, for only a good creator could create in this way. So it's laying a theological foundation. All right, does that make sense? So then we transition and move in our understanding and develop based on that foundation. So verses 6 through 9 are reflections on the power of God's word. And it begins with the statement of creation by word. Creation by word is viewed as one mode, but as majestic and awesome. It stresses the world's dependence, therefore, on God's speech and continued speech. Verse 7 has sort of a Job-like splendor. With proper response to God's majestic rule is fear and trembling. So we are now moving from congruity with Creator to inequality to Creator. So we start on this plane close with the Creator, but now it's showing, because of that greatness and that goodness, how we are also separate and unequal. So we may be close, but we are unequal. This brings us to the next movement, verses 10 through 17. And these reflect on Yahweh's, or God's, awesome and unquestioned power. They are governed by a series of verbs that describe God's characteristic actions. The usage of God looking down from heaven stresses God's freedom from the world and God's attentiveness, though, to us. So God, even though is unequal to, or we are unequal to God, and that God is free from the bonds of creation, nonetheless, God is attentive to that creation. And so this is expressing complete confidence in that attentiveness. So then we look at verses 18 through 22, we see the final sort of movement. In that it's very traditional, it has a very traditional Jewish approach to creation faith. They are not interested into the ontological questions or questions about the being or nature of God. In other words, understanding the makeup of God and trying to scientifically understand God or trying to understand therefore creation scientifically was never a part of sort of the Jewish way of approaching creation, at least especially throughout the early times. Instead, it is very cosmic in nature. And it ends creation in the fact that the action of creation is just sort of taken for granted, that's just, it is what it is. And so the ante is upped because those who fear God also have hope. All fear, though, however, those who fear in faith, like the Jewish people, have hope. All fear, Israel hopes. So the theme that is finally put in full motion is the steadfastness that was started back in verse 5. It moves from loyalty to loyalty. And that movement moves us from hope to fear and back to hope. Verses 19 to 21 give evidence for the steadfastness that leads to hope. And then some just general other observations, and then we're going to open it up for the Jewish psalmist Christian self. So start getting your reflections ready in your mind. And that is, now we can see why it begins by summoning the upright and the righteous. They are the ones who read the Creator in creation, and they stay loyal, and they hope, therefore. And so this psalm is a bold assertion about God and an announcement of self. In other words, creation is not self-evident because those who are not obedient may look and never see. It takes believing eyes. It takes faith to go from hope to fear before the awesomeness of God to back to hope. All right, so that is a very prime example of an orientation psalm, and specifically one of a creation, song of creation. So I'm going to unmute everyone, and we are going, and if you had yourself muted earlier, you're still muted, and you can unmute yourself. But let's ask, so first of all, general thoughts on the psalm, as well as Jewish Christian or Jewish psalmist Christian self. But remember, we're going to move in that. But first, general reflections, general thoughts.
It's a lot to take in.
It is a lot to take in. It is a lot to take in. I think one of the things is we sing or read these psalms every Sunday, but sometimes like at least I shouldn't say I fail to remember at times how these are they really are part of a larger story and a larger movement of faith. Not just sort of nice little, things to lift us up or things like that. That they're very, in this case, not raw, but very experiential of their life and faith.
I think in the future I will look at Psalms from an organizational standpoint different after you went over the first 5 and then the other ones. And yeah. I think I'll look at it a little differently now. Yeah.
That's actually my hope. My hope is that you'll sit there at minimum and say, oh, this is an orientation psalm, or this is a disorientation psalm. As I said, there's no test. Now, by the way, I do have a worksheet. If anyone wants the little worksheet that breaks down, I'll share it at the end of this. That kind of gives the basics of orientation, disorientation, reorientation, as well as the little subgroups. And then I've gone through and tried to match as many as I could, but I only got about halfway. So yes. You can help me with that project. Yes, honey.
Are the Psalms, were they like instrumental to the temple worship service?
In Second Temple, yes.
Okay.
We have evidence that they were a part of worship before, but they were not formally written down until probably most likely around the time of the Second Temple. But they were part of the life of the Jewish people, absolutely, before the Second Temple. But we know for sure they were an active part of Second Temple worship. Mary, were you going to say something?
Well, number one, I would say that this is a very good reason to have a reading list before before we sit down with this. I've just been puzzling over the way this is broken up in the prayer book.
Uh-huh.
There's it's kind of a space after, well, the first 11 verses are
Yes.
kind of lumped together, and then the rest of it. And I've been sitting here kind of trying to puzzle over generally what that's supposed to indicate. And I see that the first 11 verses are, I don't know, maybe somebody else can put it differently, but I see that it's just sort of a general characterization of the Lord and how mighty and great. And then the second 11 seem to be, I don't know, some verses seem like they would fit with the first 11. Um, does anybody else have anything to say about?
Well, I think that's a good thing. So in this breakup, the breakup I shared, it starts at 10, just before that, because you start to see a shift into into the sort of new movement. However, because that's a transitional one, it's also a place where the breakup, I'm guessing, I don't know for sure, they did not invite me to help write the prayer book back in 1979. And but if I had to guess, it is more based off of lectionary liturgical base breakup than as what they believed would be a good spot to stop.
Oh, okay. If you were only going to use part of a psalm for
Yeah.
some reason. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
So I'm guessing that's why, because I'm using the prayer book also right now. So and that's that I would have to guess that's why, but I don't know.
Yeah, because in the Bible that I'm looking at, the divisions are different.
Okay.
It's broken up separately into shorter chunks. But so if this was used, I mean, this brings to mind, all the stories of oral tradition and, things weren't written down. And did people gather to hear someone not necessarily recite this, but almost sing it? Or was it, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so I was thinking as you were reading it, if I was gathered in a group, maybe outdoors, there to listen to some learned person, how it would be presented, and would the whole thing, I don't know. I've always been fascinated by the story of oral history and how things are passed down.
And what's funny is there's been a lot of research into how accurate oral history is. And at least a lot of the things I've heard and read is that it's actually pretty accurate. They maintain a much better integrity, because you have to think about, someone who loses one of their five senses and how the other four raise up to sort of become heightened. Well, if written isn't your chief way, your ability to retell verbally becomes heightened, and because of the necessity of that. And so would it maybe use the exact words if I told a story? Well, no, but the integrity of the story remains. Well, especially with something like Psalms and poetry and words of wisdom, the integrity would have been pretty accurately maintained. And a lot of evidence shows of that. Shows of maybe an old early copy of something when writing wasn't as predominant, but one existed, and then as time moves on, how unchanged did it become? And it has very little didactic or editing changes.
Chris, is anything is much lost in the translations from Hebrew to Greek to Latin to English?
Always, but I think, it depends. What I always say when it comes to translations, for instance, of the English translations, is that every version of the Bible has an agenda, and I don't mean that in a bad way. What I mean though is they have a something that they are trying to achieve in their specific translation. It may be readability. It may be as accurate to the original Hebrew, or depending on when it was published, it could also say which sources they had available to them. So, for instance, starting in the late 19th century into the early 20th century, we did a lot of archaeological discoveries that found older copies of texts than what we had on hand. So it allowed us to better understand also those things. And so, by the way, like the King James Version, which our current King James, or which is actually called in England, not King James, but just the Authorized Version. The Authorized Version is a late 19th century translation. It's not Elizabethan, or rather King James, but it's not King James. That original version was actually less poetic than what we today call the King James. That was a 19th century Victorian edit to Scripture. So it's actually been Victorianized rather than Elizabethanized. So in a similar way, it's what text did they have available and what were they trying to achieve in that translation. But for instance, we've talked about, and I did in a sermon recently, the word we translate in Matthew the word church, but church is based off of the Germanic meaning. I'm trying to even remember, like assembly of faithful, or something along those lines. Whereas ecclesia would have been the Greek word used in Matthew, which is a people basically called for a purpose. Well, I mean, there's a big difference than a place, basically the insinuating in the word, a place to encounter the holy, versus a people called for a purpose, called to be sent on a purpose. Well, there's a big difference. So yes, we do lose things when we translate. Okay. But on this particular one, I'd have to have like a Hebrew in front of me, and I'm very rusty on Hebrew, very, very rusty. I don't know if I even know the alphabet anymore.
The version that I'm looking at actually has a title that they decided to put on this psalm.
Oh, what was the title?
The Greatness and Goodness of God.
Yeah.
And as you read through it, it talks about God's greatness in the first part, and then in His goodness to His people, to us. Absolutely.
And notice in that how then there's this sense of that's how it's always been, and that's how it always will be, because that's how the psalmist is experiencing it in that season. So that's why it's very orientation. Let's look at 133. We could probably sit with the unpacking the Jewish, the psalmist, Christian self. But let's just look real quick. It's only 5 verses, real short, and I'll read it real quickly. Oh, how good and pleasant it is when brethren live together in unity. It is like fine oil upon the head that runs down upon the beard of Aaron, and runs down upon the collar of his robe. It is like the dew of Hermon that falls upon the hills of Zion. For there the Lord has ordained the blessing, life forevermore. So this is an occasion of well-being. It's about how the tribe orders itself. It's about how this small group lives in community and order together. And again, it's a hymn, though. It's a generic. It's not speaking about a specific deal. We have in verse 1, it starts with this opening affirmation. This celebrates an experience, the pleasant serves to move the reader in an aesthetic or visual description. It's very descriptive in its words. So it starts with just how good and pleasant it is. And how good and pleasant is it? Well, in verses 2 and 3, we get these 2 metaphors that expound upon that opening affirmation. Precious oil is a measure of extravagance and well-being, of blessing beyond expectation. Oil was used to set things aside by God, to mark them as good and holy. Dew is the idea of being given miraculously and gives life in an otherwise parched context. This all points to what is natural and part of the generous performance of creation that is without condition. And so, thus, the image points to the fact that unity is as good as creation is said to be in Genesis 1. And so then verse 3 concludes, by the conclusion identifies, or rather, not verse 3, verses 4 and 5, identify that experience mentioned in the first verse as a blessing. This is the only statement of God or Yahweh. As I mentioned, it's very sort of cryptic. It doesn't necessarily even mention God directly. And so here we have a sort of insinuating towards God, and you'll notice that God does nothing but simply acknowledge to be the hidden source, and yet the reason is from experience. This reflects, so the Jewish side is that this reflects Israel's capacity to appreciate the common joys of life and to attribute them to the well-ordered generosity of God. And so it begs the question of when this was used. Was this used in tribe gatherings or social occasions, leaders together that came together for peace without anxiety, away from conflict, anxiety over whether the younger generation will continue without conflict, and something very Christian within it is that Jesus himself is going to not quote this, but have a similar message in John when he prays that the church may be one as he and the Father, or his disciples may be one as he and the Father are one.
Well, Chris, in my simple-mindedness, I never realized how complex the Psalms are. So thank you for awakening me to the realization that there's way more in there than what I've been reading all my life.
Yeah, and I think there's so much meaning, even more meaning, and I think this is what Brueggemann really wanted us to do, is to be able to bring that personal reflection of just kind of the words and what do the words mean, and to balance that with that understanding of the Jewish psalmist Christian and how both academically and historically what's happening, but then also as it's applied through the lived out faith, but not just as us as individuals, not forgetting that, but how it's been lived out for millennia.
Chris, is there a concordance or a document that we could look at that would help us to when we're looking at the Psalms that we could make reference to?
Yeah, so I've got that, and I need to share that. I need to email that. So what I'll say is if you email me, I'm not going to remember who all was on this right now, but if you email me, cduncan@stjamesbr.org, if you'll email me, I will send you a copy of what I have. I've kind of used Brueggemann's, I've used 2 or 3 different books of his and then tried to get as many of the Psalms written, but I don't have them all. But I have probably about half or maybe 2/3 identified as either orientation, disorientation, or reorientation.
I think that'll help.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, Mary.
I'm curious how, whatever Randy was looking at, how they titled this psalm.
Oh, yeah.
The blessedness of unity.
Okay.
Yeah. A very nice, succinct, succinct theme.
Comparing it to the way it's titled in the prayer book, which is in Latin, and I have a vague idea what it says, but I never know exactly what something says when it's in Latin.
Yes. So a lot of those are just sort of place markers and even instruction of how to use the psalm and things.
I do have something that says a song of ascents.
Yes.
ASCENTS.
Mine says that also.
ASC.
Yeah.
ENTS. A song of ascents.
Agreement. I would think agreement would kind of be more appropriate, but whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're right. Sent is
Yes, honey.
One of the commentaries that we use is called the Interpreter's One Volume Commentary on the Bible.
Uh-huh.
It's really good. I got it used.
Yep. Oh, you're muted again.
So that's what I like to use.
No, absolutely. So they have really good, HarperCollins has a good one volume, interpreters. There's even now a new interpreters that has since come out. You can get a one volume, or you can be crazy and spend lots of money like I did in seminary on the 13 volume. But yeah, there's a lot of great, but I'll also warn you, there are a lot of really bad commentaries out there. So if you're ever looking at commentaries, ask Father Drew, ask me. We'll probably have thoughts and opinions on ones to look to and ones not to. I'll say, just if you're looking at a Bible that has a good set of notes, annotated notes, the HarperCollins that Linda read from is one of my favorites, and so is the Oxford annotated. Both of them are really, really good.
Father Ralph told me about the interpreters, so I hope it's okay.
It's a good one. No, it's a good one. It's a good one. I'm big of interpreters. These are all ones I use when I'm doing exegetical work for sermons. So.
Yeah, I'm reading in the Oxford Bible, and the notes are pretty timely. It calls Psalm 133 the prayer for national unity.
Yeah.
And what I'm trying to say, this is Ann Holmes, and not.
Hi, Ann. Yes.
I'm trying to say we should all be praying this psalm. That's what I thought when we first started reading. And this
absolutely
kind of polarization and disunity, we should be praying this psalm.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
And while I want to apologize to everybody for my difficulty, and I hope that wasn't too disruptive.
No, you're fine. I'm glad you made it on.
I hear you because it's been very good. Thank you.
Thank you. No, I think that, and I would agree with that. I mean, I think that, we think of just unity, but again, what I would challenge us to do, and this would be my final thought before running off to church, is when we think of unity, we have to think about it of also what is it in? Why is unity one of our ends, one of the things we are seeking to achieve? And that in this case, it's rooted theologically. Number one, Jesus prayed it in his farewell discourse. May we be one as the Father and Son are one. But also, as this lived out, that our living in unity is in response to God's ordered creation. And that we bring the discord. We bring the disorder. And that God brought order out of chaos. That's at the heart of that first creation story. God moves over the chaotic waters where nothing really exists, and God speaks, and God's word brings order into the chaos. So from a theological standpoint, you could write a whole paper, and I'll rely on for John to write that, not me. But you could write a whole theological paper of that. Why is that a good? Is it a good just because it's a good in and of itself? Or when we look at it from a theological standpoint, it is good because that unity is grounded in the unity of the Trinity, but also grounded in the order by which God created the universe. All right. Thank y'all so much. If you have questions during the week, please send me an email. And if it's one that's worth bringing back to the whole group, I'll bring back to the whole group. And don't forget to email me if you want this kind of extra worksheets. If we were meeting in person, I'd pass them all out. But you'll have to email me, and I will forward it to you as soon as I get it. All right. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Thank you. God.
Bye.
Bye.